Okay, obviously not in the basement, out and about today, but I need to insert myself into your writing process because I have just finished all the outlines that were on time and gave my feedback and scored them, and we're struggling. This makes sense. We rush through response literature in the first week. We do it with poems instead of a short story. So when we change to the practice part of the course, we move to prose as opposed to poetry, and the piece is long form, and we just didn't get as much practice. Um, so overall, I'm seeing similar mistakes in enough of your outlines that I need to address them, talk a little bit more about what is the purpose of a response to literature essay and how to write the arguments that you need. Because what I noticed the most is that your paragraphs had topics, but no argument. And without argument, your essays had no purpose. You were not seeking to prove anything in your writing, which means that these essays ultimately they would not fail because you are organizing ideas, you're incorporating evidence, you are paying attention to sentence structure and that sort of thing. And in writing, we're focused mostly on writing practice and writing growth. So you'll be okay. But if you really want to reach those higher scores on the rubric, then your papers really need to say something. And right now, they don't. Okay, so I've got a couple of resources that I'm going to go over with you that will be some insight into what responsive literature is supposed to do and how to approach it. Some of these resources you can review on your own after this is done. So I've got them saved in another window. So let's cross fingers that I can do this out and about. All right, here we go. So this is from the Purdue Owl, which I present to you at the beginning of class as a replace their own instruction because uh, it would take me a lot of work to write all these handouts. Why do that when someone has put some great handouts together? And the best part about these handouts is that they're for college kids, right? How you write about fiction, because that's essentially what most high school English teachers are going to do to what we want you to write about. Whereas a general research paper in literature writing, that's kind of above you right now because that's when you go to like other critiques of the literature. And honestly, it's amazing stuff, but we just don't have time for that in the high school classroom. So we usually do prompt papers. But what I really wanted you to look at is how to make your argument. Because as I said, what I'm seeing right now is that you're really summaries. Now, the action there's pasts, but that's usually done in a character talking about their past in exposition or in thinking. And we don't actually do a young reader off and need some, teacher help to sit down and read the story with you. These are essentially narratives that start from like the beginning of the eve of the August bank holiday to by the time Old Misery's house comes down. That's just 3 days essentially. In the Destructors or in the Blackouts, in A Temporary Matter, that is 4 or 5 days because before the blackout begins. But even the last night is on the night that the lights come back on. I think the fourth night. So the point being, nice, concise, chronological narratives. What that causes you to do is your analysis becomes chronological as well. You say to your reader, well, first this happens, then this happens, then this happens. That's just a summary. You could talk about more like, why do the events happen in that sequence? Why did the author decide that that was the sequence of events that makes their message so impactful? But if you fall into the trap of just organizing your argument to follow along with here's why this is first in author, this place continues all the way through to the end, that it's present in all three of those moments. But the focus is not in the series of narrative actions, but rather how that symbol explores the narrative in each of those moments. The plot is going to be captured in your context. First this happens, then this happens, then this happens. But your paper needs to be about, well, why is that important? Why is this scene established in this way by the author versus the last scene that I'm going to talk about established in this way, to have that overarching takeaway that I have. And a lot of you have good theme ideas, either because you got some support from a resource on the internet, or you had an honest to gosh gut reaction to what the piece makes you feel. You talk about what this piece makes you feel, but we're not looking at the literature. Okay? So a good argument in literature needs to have a tight, specific focus. Here's an example of a loose focus, but even this might be a little bit better than what you're offering me right now. Characters in this novel spend a great deal of time, looking at each other. I like how their example of a mistake has more mistakes, I think, than they bargained for. And an examination of those gazes can give us great insight into the character. And here is the comments that they would give on that thesis. Now, the thing is that I already like this more than what I'm getting from some of you guys, because I know that gazes are going to be the aspect of the literature that we're going to look at. Whereas that aspect of literature piece is missing in some of the outlines that I read. What I do agree is that where this student author writes gives us a great insight, that's where I would critique and say, well, what is that insight? And some of you are farther in that process because you're talking about love and relationships or power, what have you. So these are two critiques. You would have to write a book to do the subject justice, right? I don't know, meaning that in order to get all the gazes right, you'd have to write and write and write and write. Some of you have probably run into this in my feedback in Temporary Matter, if you're looking at both the death of the child and the relationship, or in the Destructors, if you're trying to look at more than just the symbol of the house, maybe running into that. Too general. Which gaze in the book are you talking about? You can be more specific. Are we considering what the object, what the gaze is looking at, the person doing the looking? What is the insight? That's my main comment. What is the insight that's exactly to be gained? Okay. So here's how they fix it. When the protagonist, okay, her gaze, turns her gaze upon her former lover in their final meeting, an essential moment, her emotional blindness, more analysis, and her refusal to learn from the past that can be read in her eyes as she looks upon him. All right, so the reason why this is a solution is it is, rather than the gazes in general, it is one gaze. And it makes an arguable claim about the implications and suggests that there is a close way to read this final moment. Okay, so let's see what this looks like in a full paper. All right, so I'm going to read some of this sample paper, talk about what's going well, and things that even in this sample paper, which is put out there as a professional resource, that I still have problems with, and you can use that as your sort of pre-feedback on your own rough draft. And as always, anything that I'm saying here, if you understand it, then I am knighting you and saying that when we move into the peer edit process, you should say this to your peers. That's how we get better. Okay, opposing voices in Ballad of the Landlord. So some of you are going to wonder how to write a title for a response to literature. There's a hint. Langston Hughes' Ballad of the Landlord is narrated through 4 voices, each with its own perspective on the poem's action. Okay, context. I know that I'm going to be reading about Hughes. I know the work that we're going to be studying, and I even have some insight into what aspect of the work that we are going to be talking about. I don't know yet what that aspect of the work will accomplish. That will come in the thesis. These opposing voices of a tenant, a landlord, the police, and the press dramatize action word, do something. The author does something. Dramatize a black man's experience in a society dominated by whites. The main voice in the poem is that of the tenant who, as the last line tells us, is black. Now that's just context. That's not an argument, because I can't debate that. Because the last line tells us that the main voice is black, the tenant here, then no one's going to say like, well, what if he wasn't? That just becomes it's a nonsense argument if anyone is going to take it. That is something that the author is going ahead and giving to us. So we have to think about the history teacher and all the critiques I gave for that and why it gets tricky. You feel like you found something when you say the history teacher isn't really teaching them. He's doing silly things. But that's not analysis. That's just the correct interpretation of the poem. The question to ask us is, well, why do you know that they're silly? And why did the poet decide to make the history teacher be silly? That becomes the analysis. And so right now, this paragraph doesn't have an argument. I'm going to show you where it is. The tenant is characterized by his informal, non-standard speech. Okay, that is a little bit of a hint of what in the poem this paragraph is going to look at. He uses slang, and so now we have a signal phrase and some integration of the poem. Contracted words, member, mourn, and non-standard grammar, these steps is broken down. This colloquial English suggests the tenant's separation from the world of convention, represented by the formal voices of the police and the press, which appear later in the poem. That's the topic sentence that dramatizes a black man's experience through the use of voices. So I am taking formal voices and the colloquial voice. Colloquial means casual or conversational English. That comparison of voices links back to the thesis that says there are opposing voices in this poem of tenant, landlord, police, and press that will dramatize a black man's experience. That's my argument. And the first thing I want to look at is I want to look at the tenant's voice. My evidence that the tenant's voice is different is the slang, member, morin, and non-standard grammar. These steps is broken down. Although the tenant uses non-standard English, his argument is organized and logical. Now, that has an analytical piece because the student is pointing at these aspects, that it's organized and logical. My critique here would be is what does that organization and logic accomplish? If I go back to this student's thesis, that it's going to dramatize a black man's experience, then I want some hint as to how this helps that dramatization. Now, what we noticed in the prior paragraph that this student appears to like what we would call deductive argumentation, which means that the last sentence is going to be the topic sentence. So we'll see if that holds true. I like you guys as ninth graders to be doing inductive, which means you give me the argument and then several points to support it so that I know that you're on the right page and I'm constantly able to like know what I'm supposed to be checking for you. But let's see if this sample paper does that. Although the tenant uses non-standard English, his argument is organized and logical. He begins with a reasonable complaint and a gentle reminder that the complaint is already a week old. That's just context, no argument there, but it does help me read the poem smoothly. My roof has sprung a leak. Don't you remember I told you about it way last week? In the second stanza, he appeals diplomatically to the landlord's self-interest. Still no analysis, just context and source integration. Good stuff, but no analysis. These steps is broken down. When you come up yourself, it's a wonder you don't fall down. In the third stanza, when the landlord has responded to his complaints with a demand for rent money, the tenant becomes more forceful, but his voice is still reasonable. 10 bucks you say it's due. Well, that's 10 bucks more and I'll pay you till you fix this house up new. So I don't like this. I feel like this student maybe should put more of this stuff together, um, because it isn't until here, and this sample does say that finally the topic sentence focuses on an interpretation. But it doesn't help me teach you in the sense that all of this is context and setting up the evidence, and it isn't until here that we see an argument that begins to point us back to that thesis of dramatization of a Black tenant's experience. The fourth stanza marks a shift in the tone of the argument. At this point, the tenant responds more emotionally in reaction to the landlord's threats to evict him. By the fifth stanza, the tenant has unleashed his anger. You talking high and mighty. Hughes uses an exclamation point for the first time. I would love to see stuff like this. This breaking things down to the tiniest of letters, the tiniest of exclamation points, the tiniest of word choices that shows me that you're not just retelling me the story, but rather taking the story and breaking it apart to the smallest of pieces and talking about what it is that the author has done here to make the scene so impactful. If you spot something like this, go ahead and use it, because you could really have something unique that I haven't seen before. As the argument gets more heated, the tenant finally resorts to the language of violence. You ain't going to be able to say a word if I land my fist on you. These are the last words the tenant speaks in the poem. Perhaps Hughes wants to show how Black people who threaten violence are silenced. When a new voice is introduced, the landlords, the poem shifts to a frantic tone. See all this language that's focusing on what the writing is doing rather than the action? This response is clearly an overreaction to a small threat. Instead of dealing with the tenant directly, the landlord shouts for the police, his hysterical voice marked by repetitions and punctuated with exclamation points. Do you see that? That's what you really need more of in your commentary. Reveals his disproportionate fear and outrage, and his conclusions are equally excessive. This Black man, he claims, is out to ruin the government and overturn the land. Although the landlord's overreaction is humorous, it is sinister as well, because the landlord knows that no matter how excessive his claims are, he has the police and law on his side. My critique is going to remain the same. There's no connective here that would say, in this way, we can see how consistent the use of different voices is highlighting all of this tenant's experiences in this society that is dominated by whites. Like, this student has great evidence, great integration of that evidence, but is not linking the argument together enough times for me in a way that I feel like I can follow it. But I do want you to note some strengths here. Those comments after the evidence that are all about the word choices and the construction. I want to see more of that. And the other thing that maybe you could pick up here is that we didn't study this poem together. We have not read Ballad of the Landlord in class. Yet this essay is still understandable. When we jump into Hughes's poetry, we don't feel like it's a jarring shift. We feel like the author, Margaret here, is bringing us into that poem smoothly, helping us understand what we're about to read. All that work with the third stanza, the fourth stanza, I'm able to follow because of the context she gives. The context isn't really on the outline rubric because I'm looking at the construction of the argument, but I noticed a lot of context problems in these outlines that if you don't fix them in the draft, will show up in your final exam scores. Okay, so I hope that it is helpful to hear me. Oh, and there's the original poem here, so you can read it and check to see how this student's work does to both explain the poem clearly and have a valid interpretation. I hope this helps you continue to modify your arguments and make them the best literary arguments that they possibly can be. Okay. It's a beautiful day. I'm going to go see my family on the beach. How do I stop? that right there. Stop recording.